When we started the plans for the Masterclass, as Oliver Downing said yesterday, one of the things we wanted to do was to try and do some communication between the analytic tradition and the so-called continental. So I've tried to do a bit of that in these remarks. And as well as wanting to say to Andrew, and I'm glad that Oliver Felton is now here because he thinks there has to be hope too, that as well as there having to be hope, I'm going to try and move on, in fact I am moving on a bit in one way or another, from the one and the two to quite a few threes. Threes will crop up here. So let's just read it through if that's okay with you. So in the logics of Badger's worlds, as it were, I think I have been keeping my head above water, but not yet for long enough to try and float, as it were, a Badgerian boat, with apologies to Neurath. So my contribution will just be to go through a few formative remarks. There's nothing, I don't think, systematic about it, but I do think there is a little philosophical nub that I will come to. But before addressing Badger, before I started at all, I had become accustomed to thinking of reality as comprising, at its most general or its most basic, just beings and value or values, matters and matterings, or critical states of affairs. And I think that roughly tallies with Badger's situations and ideological structures in being an event, and with worlds and logics in the logics of worlds. However, I wouldn't want to imply that I think of my axio-ontology as corresponding to Badger's democratic materialism. There are only bodies and languages, because, like him, I do reject acquiescent pluralism and dogmatic relativism, and partly also because I would oppose any form of idealism, including linguistic idealism, and we've had some talk about that, including from Badger today. My onto-axiology, I think it's reversible there really, onto or axio first, is about reality, which I conceive as ultimately and entirely independent of minds and languages and anything anthropic, that is, simply as realist, and it's realism that I'm focusing on a bit today. Now, of course, Badger opposes democratic materialism too, and for the further reason that there are also exceptionally absolute truths, which at once define and are defined by subjects. So when I admit conscious beings, including this congregation of very sensible philosophers, of course, into that thumbnail sketch of reality, then I have to specify a third. We have a three. Basic, real, cosmic element. Call them beliefs or theories, or sometimes, for some people at least, arguably knowledge. So consequently, I tend continually to reduce all philosophy, philosophical theory, of course, to just three mutually dependent fields: ontology, the theory of being; axiology, the theory of value; and epistemology, the theory of theory itself. So prima facie, I believe that that bound triumvirate is consistent with, if not obviously supportive, of Badger's view that philosophy is formalistic, and that if we are motivated to think the form, and that we are motivated to think the form of innovation. And I certainly share his desire to create different and better worlds. Indeed, I think wishfully with Paul Eluard that already there is another world, and it is, but it is, in this one, and that it is attainable. I also think that such Trinitarian philosophy resonates well with Badger's four conditions. Each of politics, love, art and science can be thought to be apprehensible and exhaustively explicable in terms of each of their respective being, value and theory. And we had squaring the circle earlier. We might think of that as squaring the triangle, perhaps. Now, it must be acknowledged that Badger himself posits a basic philosophical triplicity, of dialectic. Rejecting Hegel's dialectic of, as he puts it, the whole, the immediate, mediation and the overcoming of mediation, Badger recommends instead the triple of the non-whole, indifferent multiplicities to start with, ontological unbinding, then worlds of appearing or the logical link, and then truth procedures or subjective eternity. However, Badger immediately resolves this triple into a 4 by adding the event. Now, by Occam's razor, I remain philosophically resolutely prejudiced in favour of my basic triangulation: ontology, axiology, epistemology. Yet, of course, the Badgerian event remains of great interest to the realist, because for Badger, events are the only exceptions to the anthropically theorisable, the only process of real change, the change which imposes, I'm quoting here, an effective discontinuity on the world where it takes place, irrespective of the laws of ontology and the regulation of logical consequences. Sets themselves are inert. He calls them absolutely immobile. If excavating reality for Badger is something like panning for power, then reality cannot be exhausted by sets alone, or even just panning for value, if not panning for power. So like Badger, I would have to incorporate the metaphysics of real dynamic process within my realist axio-ontology. And a reference to Pascal there, his dialectic, The Pulse of Freedom. Nonetheless, Badger's overall philosophical system might plausibly hold at least some appeal. This is where I'm referring, I think, to the abstract I put forward. So appeal for metaphysicians of every Western ilk. This is where I want to start introducing something analytic. Analytic and pragmatic philosophers should enjoy the mathematico-logical basis and respect for science of Badger. Badger's phenomenological theories of the subject and the object, the speculative absolutism, the inestheticism, the metapoliticism, should be welcomed by many, obviously, in what's usually called the continental tradition. Badger's materialist dialectic would obviously extend an embrace of a sort to contemporary Marxists. But given the actuality, in the logic of this intellectual world we're in, of the paradigm wars amongst the broad range of today's intellectual traditionalists, however, such conjecture that Badger can unify in that way would inevitably generate many, de facto at least, very difficult and diverging, if not exploding, questions. It would take, perhaps a little, not cynically, but a little ironically here, a veritable Badgerian event imminent to philosophical practice to meet any such demand. The form of novelty would then be writ large in that milieu, philosophy or whatever, our métier, the world that we're in today. Indeed, such an occurrence, I think, would be doubly novel. There would be exceptional convergence within the first order logic of this philosophical world or situation, but there would also be a revolutionary higher order development too, in a wider, I don't know if metastructure is the right word here, but in a political state or movement, perhaps in a collective of academic institutions or in a moment or a process of global history. Philosophy would have shown how to prefigure and to overtake reality. Now Hegel argues, someone mentioned this yesterday, didn't they, that the owl of Minerva, that philosophy always arrives in the situation too late. Marx then urged philosophers to design and to construct, at least to try to design and to construct a part of Marx, the human situation, to become the very history that we desire. And Badger, on one interpretation, seeks a critical metaphysical explanation of whether and how that Marxian ambition might be achievable. Badger's metaphysics is paradoxical. It consigns us to await contingent, aleatory, eventual truth, but he also asserts the materialist dialectic by which we understand the deployment of the critique of every critique, as he says. Every world is capable of producing its own truth, within itself. The materialist dialectic is in that way an ideology of immanence, and yet truths not only are, they also appear. That is, in Badger's sense, they're transcendent as well as immanent. Like all objects, they emerge non-anthropically from the void. Some of those non-anthropic objects become anthropic, perhaps, when they become human bodies and when they become subjects, but they emerge non-anthropically from the void. Truths are realist, they're automatically realist, but they still exist only as exceptions, and they still require, paradox here, anthropic fidelity. and yet the form of the subject is at the same time a function of an eternal truth. Now I think this is just one little set of indications of how fertile it is to dig around in Badiouian fields. I think it's really very interesting. A quote from Paul Valery here: a problem is a light, an insoluble problem is a sun. The more you go into it, the more exciting and possibly illuminating the insights can be. Nevertheless, I will neither try in this little paper seriously to unpick these interesting paradoxes, nor try here at all to explore the complex implications of Badger's general system for history as such, material history or theoretical history or philosophical history. However, I would like to assert, as an implication, something like an implication of this very paragraph, that the human need, I mentioned while you were out, Andrew, that my punchline is going to be there's got to be hope. That the human need for true, effective and immediate engagement with reality seems to me to be a sort of argument for philosophical realism. For only via such realism could humanity hope, and it's got to have hope, to insulate its commitments from the vagaries and falsehoods of the Deleuzian side of things, the contextual partialities and prejudices, perhaps what Badiou calls here democratic materialism. Now, as the programme abstract shows, I have in mind a big project, which I'm working on, a thorough critical appreciation of what Alan Badger's unique metaphysical position is, which will require both a comprehensive and accurate exegesis of Badger's metaphysics, but will also require a detailed, defensible specification of what in general would make a good metaphysics good in the first place. I mean, it's a very analytic thing to do, isn't it? To take a step back and say, hang on, what are the criteria here? What's your starting point? And we can do that. If there aren't, though, any good makers in the world, analytic philosophers talk about truth makers in the world, so analogously, I think if there aren't actually any good makers in the world, then I think we can ask the question directly, though. We can ask it ontologically as, what is an adequate metaphysical system? Or we could ask it epistemologically as, how can we justify metaphysical beliefs? Or we could ask it axiologically, that's my trinity, how can we evaluate metaphysics? Now these, I think, are substantive and substantial and methodological philosophical challenges, again for which there won't be time on this occasion, but I'm just probing here a small part of it in a little, I think, sympathetic to Badiou detail, whether Badiou's realist materialism is reasonable. Now, metaphysics, of course, is always harder, I think, than I've just been implying. There are significant interpretive differences about Badiou's metaphysical system itself, for one thing, and for another, there seem to be at least as many suggested metaphysical methodological criteria for evaluative purposes as there are at least substantive metaphysical perspectives in the first place from which to choose, and having chosen to evaluate. I've chosen the late influential analytic philosopher Bernhard Williams as my exemplar of analytic philosophy here. He observed a long time ago, shortly after I was born, that unless you're a dogmatic naturalist, you wouldn't attempt to prove a metaphysics inductively. You've got to be a naturalist if you think that metaphysics is derivable like science. Furthermore, unless you swallow some other dogma than naturalism, then you couldn't actually derive any metaphysics deductively either. You've got to start somewhere. All inquiry's got to start somewhere. Now, such dogmata are sometimes referred to as axioms or postulates. 17th century mathematically inspired rationalists sought axioms that need no justification. For example, Descartes' putatively self-evident and limitingly sceptical I doubt, for example, from which he then did proceed deductively. Badiou defies the Hegelian whole by asserting foundationally and axiomatically that the one is not, that being is not one. And he argues, I would say, abductively, rather than inductively or deductively, but abductively to a good explanation, that one is best understood, defined, interpreted or explained or whatever, not as being at all, but as an operation, a process of counting as one. This brings to mind, in the analytic tradition, Frege's functions, which Frege has just functions and objects in his basic ontology. That's all he's got. And functions are crucial for the ontology, but you can't, by definition, objectify them. You can't actually talk about functions as if they were objects, because they are not objects. They are the opposite of objects. So there's a parallel there. Badger himself refers to his realist materialism sometimes as an axiom, sometimes in other places as a maxim, and often as a postulate. So the postulate of materialism, given I think in the middle of Logics of Worlds, is that for any given world, every atom of that world is a real atom. That is, a basic minimal set formed as part of an object in a world by the logics of that world directly from the void. It carries, as it were, non-anthropic being itself from inconsistent multiplicity into appearance in a world. However, as I said, metaphysical arguments are generally neither inductive nor deductive, although they might be partly abductive. Metaphysical postulates, say, seem to be promoted and defended by a sort of dialectical method, and it's interesting that this is something that's proposed over half a century ago by an analytic philosopher, by a sort of dialectical method, both a destructive movement, something you believe is now urged, in fact, to be wrong, and a constructive movement, something that you probably rather resist, that you don't really want to believe, is then presented as irresistibly right. That's how you try to establish a new and defend a new metaphysical position. For example, the classical skeptical empiricist argument from illusion turns on the destructive assertion that we don't really perceive objects as such, to the connected, constructive proposal that every case of perception, whether it's veridical or not, crucially starts from some form of subjective sensation. It doesn't start from an object at all. Now that is an anti-realist metaphysics of experience. Now on the other hand, of course, contrasting with that, Plato had started from the same negative argument from illusion, and then proposed, in place of the changeable phenomenal world, a positive realm of immutable ideal abstractions, the realist metaphysics of forms. Note as an aside here that we've now embraced, I think, the trinity of Plato's formalisms, Descartes' mathematicisms, and Hegel's dialectic, arguably Badger's three greatest historical influences, another three. However, as we've seen above, Badger expanded his metaphysics to embrace as a fourth requirement the postulate of eventual truth procedures. And there, absolute realism is owing more, I think, than to Platonic forms alone. There are perhaps also three sources and component parts of Badger's realism. Apologies to Lenin here, I'm obviously taking off his three sources and component parts of Marx's socialism. There are three sources and component parts of Badger's realism: Neoplatonism, the aleatory and unconscious real of Lacan, and the Marxian inversion of Hegelian idealism. Following Marx, of course, Althusser had maintained in the late 1960s, and many of us are still stuck there, that all philosophy divides crucially between just materialism and idealism. And we know that Badger was for a while an earnest student of Althusser. What motivates the constructive moment of this dialectic of producing and defending a metaphysical position is the metaphysician's creative desire to apprehend reality, something very human. In Badger's case, the metaphysical desire is better to know perhaps how to understand epistemologically and deploy, as a matter of a human agent, reality ontologically in the causes of artistic, scientific, amorous and political advancement involving axiology. From the point of view of Anglophone philosophy, embroiled as it is in its allegedly unsolvable problems, it could be taken to be one of the requirements of a candidate metaphysical perspective that it does say something appealing about the aporias concerning the variety of realisms and the range of irrealism, idealism, anti-realism and so on, that metaphysics, that proposed metaphysics, would overcome or transcend or synthesize or give, of which at least a partly adequate account. Nicholas Rescher, American pragmatist philosopher, argues that philosophy is essentially, methodologically, tripartite. It's erotetic, it's always trying to get an answer to a question. It's aporetic, it's eternally insoluble. And it's dialectical, it moves over itself, quite a classical Hegelian dialectic, I think he believes, going on in the American pragmatic tradition. It's an ever-questioning, profoundly puzzling, self-generating developmental process. And he thinks that realism is one of our classical, evergreen, aporetic preoccupations. We might also observe here the methodological point that Badger himself often adopts a tridental approach, most obviously in Being and Event, arguing for the same thesis in at least three ways, conceptually, historically, and mathematically. Yeah, there's something going for three, isn't there? The destructive metaphysical step.
Sorry, I forgot to tell you 15 minutes. That's 20 minutes.
Have I had 20 minutes? Have I got start?
Welcome to carry on.
You may not get questions.
Okay, I'll carry on. The destructive metaphysical step usually involves, at least in part, the motive of improving upon some of its history. Badger explicitly acknowledges that philosophy must circulate in its own history, and in this regard, Kant and the mathematician Husserl, I think, are important for Badger's ontology. Kant had sought epistemologically, of course, still basically in the Cartesian tradition, to transcend phenomenal knowledge, to learn something ontological about things in themselves. But for Badger, transcendence is the intrinsically ontological and material process why objects, consistent multiples, sets, are formed from the void, from inconsistent multiplicity, and then appear in a world. Analogously, Badger reversed Husserl's phenomenological reduction from subjective to the objective. Instead of bracketing out all references to putatively realist existence, as Husserl advocated, Badger sought to allow consistency to be seen to emerge by neutralizing its intentional or lived dimension, as he put it, in a world. But Badger's acknowledgement that real change, nevertheless, might remain purely and simply unthinkable at once further testifies, I think, to his realism, whilst at the same time it also challenges it, as you expect in someone trying to propose a new metaphysical position. He acknowledges that such realism entails an inevitable paradox. Radically innovative being, a sight or a singularity, must be non-anthropically self-determining. It must refer to its own transcendental indexing, as well as conforming to the transcendental regulation of the logic of the world in which it appears. So this is one of the points of Badger's system where I think there is exposed a call for bootstrapping that's comparable to the traditional rationalist quest for self-evident, the Cartesian quest for self-evident axiomatic certainty. Now, I think this is a philosophically interesting and critical component of Badger's system. His fidelity to the Kantorian event, set theoretic ontology, leads to technical difficulties with defending both the axiomatic basis of his metaphysical system and the praxeological explanation of real radical change in the world. Badger's mathematicism alone cannot justify his, I think, faith in realism and provide, at the same time, resources for progress. However, we may have recourse to my interrelated philosophical trinity. Of course, ontology and realism are not independently sui generis. Ontology nests in philosophy, which necessarily provides, I think, axiology and epistemology too. They can't be separated. So perhaps reflexive support for realism can be found in the reflexive appreciation of philosophy. So here I think, and this is why I'm defying questions, is the philosophical nub of the paper. In Badgerian metaphysics, realism entails the self-determination of objects. Now it seems profoundly odd to try to think of non-anthropic being or matter doing something that we normally think of a human agent as doing, in forming, in producing some sort of existence and somehow referring reflexively to that very process too. But both things have to happen for Badgerian realism. Now the way forward is perhaps to fall back on Badger's general metaphysical ontology of set theory and events and formalise as much as we can and appreciate that that's the best model that we've got. The truth, significance and value of his realism can perhaps be justified in that way, but also systemically in terms of Badger's whole developing metaphysical position. And that requires our fidelity. That ultimate circularity can only be viewed as virtuous rather than a vicious circle when we know that the metaphysician's motives are virtuous, when we're selecting a metaphysic, when we're deciding whether we support Badger's metaphysic or not. When, as we suggested above, the goal is the progressive process of the materialist dialectic in place of the squalid compromises of democratic materialism. Perhaps this problem of authorising realism also chimes with Badger's explanation of the double role of the eventual multiple, which we noticed above when we conjectured about the double novelty of philosophical work itself causing real progress. The sight is a being which has its own power of becoming from the void, but which is also sufficiently recognisable by subjects as true eventual change. Only philosophy, if and when it would have eliminated its Hegelian phase lag and overcome its alienation from reality, only philosophy could encapsulate an appreciation of this process in all its complexity. The socialist vanguard would be fueled then by philosophical power. Power not from Deleuze's proposed immanent anthropic conceptual forces, but perhaps by a combination, I conjecture, of Badger's and Bhaskar's transcendental, realist, dynamic and generative tendencies which can be modelled in set theory. Who is to say whether any one of my trinity, ontology, epistemology or axiology, my three preferred corners of the philosophical hat, who's to say whether any one of them is more basic or primary than any other? Historically, since Descartes, sceptical epistemology has been to the fore. How on earth and what on earth can we know? However, why shouldn't we, as a matter of an article of faith, as Badger does, I think, why should we not put the what first? The reality itself, of which we seek knowledge, and over and through which, of course, we also seek influence. In apprehending realist ontology directly, moreover, we are also, I think, unavoidably doing axiology, discovering what matters and so what needs to be fixed, and getting some clues as to how. Perhaps we would automatically be engaging then with a Badgerian sight of a world as engaging with it as a transformative agent. Why should philosophers prefer to indulge the prejudices of epistemology and skepticism in the first place? We might simply need, rather, to indulge the prejudices, if they are, of ontology and realism, simply and truly, to be able to generate singularities, as it were, to have them to hurl at neoliberal capital. Perhaps widespread fidelity to ontology-led speculative realism, to a new concept of the absolute, as Badger didn't actually talk to us about yesterday, will become an eventual part of the revolutionary process of truth procedures of global liberation. Its philosophical justification will be revealed by its praxis. Under socialism, and that's a phrase that I really haven't said for quite a long time, under socialism, the gap between philosophy and its four conditions will vanish. Progress will entail the philosophical self-determination of reality. But we need hope as well as truth.
Okay, yeah, so we do have some time for some questions or so.
Terminological point. What, according to you, is the relationship between realism and materialism?
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? And I deliberately blurred it over. I don't want to say that, on the one hand, realism is that which is and always was and whatever will be completely independent of humanity and our ability to conceive of it, to talk about it or whatever. So realism is a cosmic out there. Materialism, well, materialism, I suppose, is a variety of realism. It's a realism which says that what it is that's cosmically out there and completely non-anthropic can be called matter, and I have a lot of sympathy, I think, with that basic Marxian concept that we are all stuck in this dialectical process of material development, which maybe physics can tell us quite a lot about. Physics generally does the stuff of matter, doesn't it? And like Lacan, most of us is stuck within the grey, unconscious unfolding of dialectical materialism, and the Badiouian truth event, it starts can make holes in that, and maybe we can get to grips with some influence, as I'm suggesting philosophically, over that change. So on the other hand, I could start that again and put materialism first, and think of a realist interpretation of materialism. These concepts are always a bit interchangeable, but that's roughly what I mean. Realism is a cosmic out there, and materialism is a good way of thinking of realism, but perhaps not the only one.
Okay, so one more.
Go on then.
Just the opening claim fascinates. To have hope, humanity needs a philosophical realism.
Yeah.
So, what about Kant and the regulative idea? To have the idea of freedom, I'll act as if I have freedom. I have no knowledge of the reality of my own freedom. I have no grasp of the thing in itself whatsoever. It is a universal ideal that all rational human beings can accede to. But there I have hope without
the philosophy, without philosophical
grasp on
yeah.
the absolute.
Yeah, it's a long time since I read that. I can't really comment on Kant. But as I argued, perhaps it is to philosophy when it's reduced the gap that exists at the moment, that Badger correctly points out, between itself and its four conditions, when that gap is reduced and philosophy is in reality, and philosophers are doing reality rather like mathematicians are doing ontology, we will find out how to achieve that freedom. I suspect that Kant's notion of freedom, while still a universal, wouldn't have been my post-Marxist version of freedom, and of course there are lots of versions of freedom, and I wouldn't want to say that a Kantian version of freedom leads to Robert Nozick's neoliberalism, but maybe it does.
Sure. But is this idea of philosophy coming closer and closer to its conditions, is that some kind of version of Marx's idea of the withering away of the state?
Well, yes, that did occur to me. Yeah, that we keep on trying to throw off the state and have genuine democracy. So it would be a sort of materialist, dialectic democracy, and not a democratic materialism. And
right.
But so yes, possibly. Yeah. I mean, if people are living their lives individually and collectively and globally that we wish for ourselves, that we're trying to prefigure in our actions now, then we wouldn't need certain forms of state anyway.
Are you anarchist again?
No. I don't think so. But I can see a bit of anarchy in me and a bit of Hegel in me, but no, I think I'm a revolutionary Marxist.
Right. Okay. I thought so.
As a ninja said yesterday, it's a red! I'm a red! A true red.